Hi, this is Craig Jansen doing my final course synthesis for effective assessment for Dr. Norm Vaughn at Mount Royal University. Basically, this was a kind of inquiry-based learning project where we were able to come up with our own topic and figure out what we want to answer. My thought process in this was to choose making videos, I guess, and getting videos from educators that I know, my own personal learning network, basically asking them to in a short video describe ways that they are efficient and effective in their communication. Once doing that, I gathered and I have feedback from 11 people, and once gathering that, I kind of broke down and categorized things into kind of 6 subcategories of how to be effective and efficient as a teacher. My goal for this is to add more tools to my own skill set in preparing to be an educator. I'm hoping to gain some practical strategies and ways that I can be better prepared for when the time comes and I'm in the classroom. So the 6 categories that I was able to kind of classify and break things down into, the first was kind of notes and record taking. The second was feedback. Third was rubric. Fourth was relationships. Fifth was diversity. And 6th was testing. I'm very fortunate in my personal learning network. I have some videos from some university professors. I have some feedback from my grandfather, who was a high school superintendent of the school district in Saskatchewan. I have friends who are elementary school teachers and high school teachers, and I have a sister who works in a resource room at a high school, and another friend who works in an elementary kind of resource and second language room. So there's a wide spectrum of people who had input into this, and I found it quite valuable. So for notes and record taking, a few of the things that really came out, especially with elementary school, which is our focus, is to have a focus on always being kind of in the state of mind of doing assessment. You're always wanting to be looking for informal assessment. You're always watching kids. You're always asking questions. One thing that kind of came up from one of the teachers was she kind of asked herself the question, what is the next step? So she's watching her kids, seeing where they're at, and constantly asking, what's the next step? How can I take this kid from what they know to the next place? A lot of the different videos and audio files that I got discussed keeping records, right? Making sure one teacher talked about using a notebook and having that always running, where they're writing down questions that kids ask, so they can return to those and investigate those further, or just making kind of observations about students. A few teachers mentioned that good note-taking and good record-keeping will greatly assist in doing report cards. I feel that note-taking is more related to effective assessment, with your gathering good data, good notes, good records on kids. And a few different ways that I've realized with this is they just discuss find a way that works for you. And so I look at the example of a notebook, and I already know that that's not something that would work for me. Different things, the Dragnet is something that interests me, something that converts plain speak into text. That's something that would interest me. Different portfolios, self-assessment, things like that, different ways like that. But I'm really realizing that taking good notes is a good way to be effective as an educator and for assessment. The second one was feedback, subcategory that I got, and a few things that stuck out is feedback needs to be timely, and it needs to be specific. So those are 2 major things, and we need to be able to get our stuff back to kids quickly before they forgot about it, and we need to be specific. Don't just write good job, don't just assign a grade value, have something written, in fact. And one of the profs, Derek Groves, who's a teacher in Medicine Hat, he discussed being at a conference recently where they talked about not attaching value to feedback, having written feedback without a value. So if a kid sees 4 to 5, and then some written thing, all they're going to focus on is the 4 to 5. So what they say is they encourage to just give written feedback, so kids look at the feedback and they're taking it and they're processing it instead of just being worried about the grade that they received. Other things that I heard and learned from this is try and have a positive slant with as much of the feedback as possible. Again, these are things that we've discussed in class and that draw connections to the textbook and things like that. So those are some ways to be effective in assessment with feedback, and some ways that we can be more efficient in this is peer editing is one thing that really came out. A few different of the educators mentioned that lightens your load as an educator. By the time it gets to you, a lot of the mistakes have already been found and corrected and things like that. Plus, it's a good learning exercise for students to see what other kids are doing and how their work compares and things like that. Another one that came through was fostering self-assessment with our feedback. And so we want to really be talking through why we're giving the feedback and what we're saying with students, trying to get that internal voice playing of their own self-assessment, and peer editing plays into that as well. We want to get kids to the point where they're solving their own problems and being able to critically look at work that they've done and say, is this good or is this not good? How could this be better? And things like that. So that's kind of the feedback section. Rubric, this kind of ties in with feedback. There's some overlap here, so I'm just going to go into rubric. Multiple people, and this ties really nicely into what we talked about in our chapter on backwards design, discussed different ways that they use rubrics, and I found all of them quite valuable. The one obviously that we discussed in class and that many of the educators mentioned is doing rubrics with your class, having individuals do a rubric, and handing out the rubric before the assignment goes. So the kids are aware of what their learning outcomes are and what they're going to be marked on, what we're looking for. So there's kind of no surprises, right? One of the teachers said no curveballs. And so I think a rubric is a great way to fix that. When we're assessing kids, especially younger kids, we don't want to be trying to trick them and saying, hey, you know all this, and then throw a curveball in a test or something like that. We want to have them prepared for what they, because we want our assessment to be of what they've learned. And if we haven't taught them, how can we assess them? I think as you get into older, I think there's an element where curveballs can be acceptable in the sense of, synthesize this or something that is taking what they know and working with it in a new way. But again, I don't really feel that would be something that's maybe shady or a curveball. With rubrics, some of the things that I got was pick one aspect of your rubric or one of the learning outcomes and focus on that. So let's say you have kids writing a 4-paragraph assignment and your rubric has 4 outcomes that you're working on. Mark looking just for one outcome in each paragraph. That way you're kind of sampling and you're not killing yourself marking the whole thing in depth. You're able to move through quickly, but you're still getting accurate samples of the kids' work. I think that's a great way to be more efficient in there. The class rubric is a big one. I discussed that already. One that I got that I found really helpful was designing a master sheet kind of rubric where the rubric has the answers or what the best answers would look like, and then giving that as part of your feedback. So they get the rubric before, maybe without the ideal answers because they need to find those on their own. But then when they get a rubric at the end that has your final kind of assessments or feedback or whatever on it, it has a master sheet of kind of what would be an ideal paper. And so that's a way that you could, or paper or project or whatever, that would be a way to expedite your feedback process. You'd still be able to give valuable feedback saying, hey, this is what an excellent project or piece of work would look like without having to write it down 100 times for each separate kid or whatever like that. And again, you can circle specific aspects that maybe need to be highlighted or they need to work on or something they missed or something they really nailed. And in that sense, you can do one really nice rubric and you can use that for most of your feedback, just picking and choosing and using that as a framework. So that's some different ways that I kind of were talked about on how to use rubrics. Relationships, that was another thing that was discussed by a few different of the educators. Getting to know your kids, and again, I think that this is something that not necessarily for efficient, as much more under the effective umbrella, where the better you know kids, the more you're going to be able to design things that are meaningful for them in their learning, and the more you're going to be able to kind of be understanding of their situation. One of my friends who's a high school teacher, he uses Google Docs and Google Forms a lot, and he'll kind of send like a little bit of like a couple questions for the day home that the kids go on and can just answer. And one of the things that he often does is at the end he says, what are you most worried about for finals, or what are you most excited about for Christmas break? Something that's just a short little question, but you get some kids, and that's a chance for your students to connect with you, tell you a little bit about themselves, And again, in building that relationship, I think that helps. And again, I've been advised by the educators in these videos is that something that will help you as you're designing and trying to come to a better understanding of what your students may be going through. Diversity. This is a way, and again, a lot of the stuff that I was talking about here ties into our class on exceptional students that we took this semester as well. Again, learning to assess in a multitude of ways. Some kids are gonna, with different multiple intelligences and things like that we've discussed in previous teaching theory classes, kids are gonna learn and they're gonna perform better in different mediums. So some kids will be great writers, some kids will be terrible writers, some kids will be very good at speaking and giving oral presentations, some will have major anxiety around that and struggle. So learning to assess in a different ways, because we don't want to, unless you're assessing how good their writing is, you don't want their writing skills to affect their assessment, right? That gives you, that's a bias, and again, we talked about that in one of the chapters with our textbook, avoiding those biases. And I think assessing in a diverse ways is a good way to do that. One of the university professors that sent in a video discussed using diversity, saying that he often will do some smaller assignments and some bigger assignments, and when you do a bunch of small assignments that aren't worth as much, again, for a university course, you're doing that for elementary school, that's going to look different because it's not so much about collecting grades as it is a focus on learning. But the more short assignments you can do, the better your wealth of knowledge about your students is going to be from that. You're going to get a more sharp or a more clear understanding of where they're at in their learning. And that also provides more opportunities for feedback, for peer review, self-assessment, all those things. And so in doing smaller projects, we might not get as much depth, but we get a wider breadth of work where we can be giving kids feedback and working on areas that they need improvement. For diversity with special needs and things, again, my sister is a resource room teacher in a high school in Saskatchewan, and she discussed that a lot of teachers have trouble knowing how far to modify their tests for special needs, or how to tweak their exams, or things like that. And again, it's tough as a teacher because you want everything to be fair and even for kids, that you don't want to tweak things too much or not enough or things like that. But she gave a really good analogy of, you wouldn't ask a kid who has bad eyes to do a test without glasses on, right? And in the same sense, you wouldn't ask a kid who can't read to do a test that involves a lot of reading. And reading, of course, can't read because of a reading disability or something like that, or a learning disability. And so some things to keep in mind with that, and that's just a good perspective, because that's one thing that even through the effective assessment course and through the different readings that we did this year, struggling to find, if a kid isn't on an IPP, how far can we go to tweak exams and what's fair, and how do I know what to do for that. And I think, again, that ties into your relationship with a kid and how well you know them and their family or their guardians and their situation. I think really can speak into how well we do in being diverse in our assessment. The sixth category that I kind of came up with was testing, and again, a lot of that ties into what we just talked about, how to do testing in diverse ways, and being willing to modify testing to get accurate assessments. Again, if I'm not assessing reading or writing, but a kid is very poor or weak in those areas or has a learning disability that affects those areas, I need to be willing to provide alternatives in the sense of being able to go to a different space where it's quiet, or have a scribe, or be able to do the test orally or written if they prefer that, and different things like that. And so there's different ways with testing that gets affected. Another thing with testing that was discussed by a few different people is the concept of a cheat sheet or different things like that. And again, for me, being not old school, but that was a kind of foreign concept for me in high school and even in university. But if our main goal is learning, cheat sheets seemed like a great idea. From the educators that discussed them, themes came up on the sense of it's going to get your kids to study, it's going to force them to study, it's going to reward those students who are taking good notes, who are attending your classes. And again, as you get into older grades, that makes more sense. For younger kids, hopefully they're going to be there more, and you don't want to punish the kids that aren't there. So there's some tweaking that needs to be done within that. But I think it provides an opportunity when we do a cheat sheet for you to test how well your kids work with knowledge and things like that. Another aspect of testing that was really discussed was pre-testing. Was discussed by a few people, getting that baseline, and again, that ties all the way back into notes and records, your observations. A lot of teachers said it's very important that we are able to find a baseline of where our students are at. That is going to give us a much clearer idea of what we need to do and where we need to go. And so, yeah, there's lots there. There are lots of strategies, a couple of tools that people are using. I didn't include Jared's video from last year that I had on assessment, but a couple of things that were in there was that Fast on Capture, which is a great program using Google Docs where kids can work together. A lot of other things that some different teachers and educators talked about is different strategies they use to collect assessment from the class. Some have, the kids just answer questionnaires. Some will do kind of just group stuff where you're asking the whole classroom, what do we know about this? And, think, pair, share, different things like that. One other thing that was interesting was, what was it called? It was called Soccer Quiz, something like that. And it's an online quizzing site where you can put up quick quizzes and the kids can go in and do, and they can see which ones they got wrong. And again, that kind of pre-knowledge will help influence what they need to learn and what they need to work on and where their areas of growth need to be. All in all, in this video, and these videos that I collected, I gained a lot of new knowledge. A lot of it was confirmation of stuff that we had talked about in class, and it was helpful for me and my own learning style to see that the theory that we're discussing about in class is doable and it's realistic, and it is being worked out currently in a lot of classrooms by educators. But then it was also great to see different ways that experienced educators have come up with their own slightly different methods or found out what's worked best for them. Or found different ways to assess or gather data about their students in efficient ways. I think big things that I take away from this moving forward is the concept of really not necessarily having to assess every single thing kids do, but really trying to make my assessment about finding out where kids are at and using that formative assessment to impact our summative assessments. And so if kids are going to be doing a business letter for their summative assessment, I'm going to have a few formative assessment things where we're going to look at some business letters. We're going to practice writing them. We're going to do peer editing on those things and different ways like that in which I can use assessment to gather data about my kids, as well as help form the way that we're going to go about doing the summative assessments. Thank you again to all who contributed to this by sending in videos or emails or audio files. I appreciate it, and I learned a lot and look forward to the journey that is assessment. Thanks.